Close your eyes and imagine walking through the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace. The walls echo with centuries of royal laughter, whispered secrets, and the soft rustle of silk gowns. But as you turn a corner into a forgotten wing, the laughter fades. Here, in these dusty rooms, lie the untold stories of princes and princesses who were meant to rule, but were instead taught to hide. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey through time, a journey that will reveal one of the darkest secrets royal families have kept for centuries. This isn't just a story about disability or medical conditions. This is a story about love and fear, about the impossible choices families make when reputation matters more than humanity, and about children who wore invisible crowns while the world pretended they didn't exist. Our story begins in an era when royal blood was considered divine, when kings and queens ruled not just by law, but by the belief that God himself had chosen their family lines. Every royal child born was seen as a gift from heaven, destined for greatness, trained from their first breath to embody perfection. But what happens when perfection isn't perfect? In the grand tapestries of royal history, woven with threads of gold and silver, there are deliberate gaps, spaces where certain threads have been carefully removed. These missing threads represent children who should have been celebrated as heirs to thrones, but instead became the family's most closely guarded secrets. The medical world today knows these children had Down syndrome, a genetic condition caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21. But centuries ago, when science couldn't explain the almond-shaped eyes, the gentler muscle tone, and the different ways these children learned and grew, fear filled the void where knowledge should have been. Royal physicians would examine these newborns and shake their heads gravely. Court advisors would whisper of bad omens and cursed bloodlines, and parents who commanded armies and shaped the fate of nations would find themselves powerless against their own terror of public judgment. This fear would set in motion a pattern of secrecy that would repeat itself across continents and centuries, creating a hidden dynasty of forgotten royalty. Let me introduce you to two little girls whose story will break your heart and change how you see royal history forever. Their names were Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, and they were born into what should have been a fairy tale life. Picture the year 1919. The First World War has just ended, and hope fills the air like spring blossoms. In the grand estates of the British aristocracy, a baby girl named Nerissa takes her first breath. 7 years later, in 1926, her younger sister Katherine follows. These aren't just any children. They are first cousins to the future Queen Elizabeth II, members of one of the most powerful families in the world.
But as the sisters grew, it became clear that their development was different. They spoke differently, learned differently, and moved through the world in their own unique way. Today, we would celebrate these differences and provide support. But in the 1920s and 1930s, the family saw only shame. Imagine being a parent in that position, loving your children desperately, yet living in a world that tells you they are an embarrassment to everything your family represents. The internal conflict must have been devastating. How do you choose between protecting your children and protecting your family's reputation? The Bowes-Lyon family made their choice, and it would haunt them for decades. When Nerissa was still a young girl and Katherine barely a teenager, a black car arrived at their family estate. The sisters were told they were going on a trip, perhaps to a special school or a countryside retreat. They had no way of knowing this journey would last for the rest of their lives. The car took them to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey, a long-term institution for people with intellectual disabilities. But this wasn't just any placement. This was an erasure so complete, so calculated, that it defies belief. The family didn't just hide the sisters away, they declared them dead. Can you imagine? Two living, breathing girls who loved and laughed and dreamed in their own way were officially listed as deceased in family records. For nearly 70 decades, the world believed these royal children had died in childhood, when in reality, they were living just miles away from the palaces where their cousins grew up. But their story of isolation was just beginning, and it would soon connect to similar tales of hidden royalty across Europe. As Nerissa and Katherine were settling into their institutional life in England, across the North Sea in Germany, another royal family was facing the same impossible choice. The year was 1915, and Princess Alexandrine of Prussia had just been born to Crown Prince Wilhelm and his wife. Prussia in 1915 was a nation at war, a kingdom where strength and military prowess defined royal identity. Into this world of rigid expectations came a princess who would challenge everything her family believed about perfection. But here's where Alexandrine's story begins to diverge from that of the Bowes-Lyon sisters, creating a fascinating contrast that reveals the different ways royal families dealt with their fears. Crown Prince Wilhelm and his wife made a different choice. They kept Alexandrine at home. This might sound like a happy ending, but it was more complex than simple acceptance. Alexandrine lived with her family, appeared in some photographs, and attended special schools. Yet she was systematically excluded from all royal duties and kept away from public scrutiny whenever possible.
Picture family gatherings where Alexandrine sat at the table but was never mentioned in official accounts. Imagine palace life where she was loved in private but invisible in public. She lived in a strange middle ground, neither hidden away like the Bowes-Lyon sisters, nor truly accepted as a full member of the royal family. Alexandrine survived well into adulthood, living until 1980. For 65 years, she existed in this twilight world of partial acceptance, watching her siblings and cousins take on royal roles while she remained forever in the background. Her story shows us that even when royal families chose not to institutionalize their disabled children, the fear of public judgment still created its own form of imprisonment. A golden cage where love existed, but acceptance did not. This pattern of love in the shadows would appear again and again as our journey through royal history continues, connecting Alexandrine's story to another powerful family across the border in France. From the rigid courts of Prussia, our story flows to the tumultuous political landscape of France, where a future president was learning that some battles cannot be won with military strategy alone. Charles de Gaulle, a name that would become synonymous with French resistance, leadership, and national pride. This was a man who would stand against Hitler, rebuild a nation, and become one of the most respected leaders of the 20th century. But before he commanded armies or led governments, he was simply a father holding his newborn daughter and facing a truth that would change his life forever. Anne de Gaulle was born in 1928. And from her first moments, it was clear she had Down syndrome. But this story would unfold differently from the tales of hidden princesses and shadow royalty we've been following. Charles de Gaulle, the man who would never surrender to Nazi occupation, made a decision that was revolutionary for its time. He would not surrender his daughter to society's expectations either. Anne was raised at home, surrounded by her family's love. But more than that, she formed a special bond with her father that would influence his character in ways the history books rarely mention. The general, who appeared stern and unyielding in public, was tender and patient with Anne, spending hours with her, protecting her, and learning from her in ways that military academies had never taught him. Yet even this story of love comes wrapped in the same themes of concealment that we've seen before. Anne was cherished privately, but largely shielded from public life. She rarely appeared at official events, and her condition was not openly discussed in political circles. When Anne died tragically young at just 20 years old from pneumonia, something beautiful emerged from the family's grief. Yvonne de Gaulle, Anne's mother, founded a foundation and hospital dedicated to caring for children with disabilities, transforming private sorrow into public service.
But even in this act of commemoration, Anne herself remained largely unknown to the French people her father would later lead. She became a catalyst for change while remaining hidden from history. This pattern of disabled royal and prominent children inspiring progress while themselves remaining invisible connects Anne's story to the broader tapestry of hidden lives we've been exploring.
As we step back to see the full picture, a disturbing pattern emerges. Across different countries, different decades, and different political systems, powerful families were making the same choice: hide the children who don't fit the image of perfection. But the stories we know, Nerissa and Katherine in England, Alexandrine in Prussia, Anne in France, these are likely just the visible peaks of a vast submerged mountain of hidden lives. Historical records suggest that what we've uncovered represents only a fraction of the true scope of this royal secrecy. Let me take you deeper into this hidden world, back to medieval times when superstition ruled and medical knowledge was non-existent. In these earlier centuries, children born with visible differences or intellectual disabilities faced even harsher fates. Picture a medieval castle where a royal child is born with characteristics we now recognize as Down syndrome. The court physician, working with knowledge that's centuries away from understanding genetics, might declare the child cursed or marked by evil spirits. Royal advisors, concerned about the implications for the dynasty's divine mandate, would whisper about bad blood or God's displeasure. Historical records from these periods are deliberately sparse. Royal families went to great lengths to ensure these stories were never written down. But glimpses survive in monastery records, in private letters that escaped destruction, and in architectural evidence of hidden wings in ancient castles. Some historians believe that many such children were quietly sent to monasteries or convents, where they would live out their lives in religious seclusion. Others were reportedly taken to remote family estates, far from court life, where they were cared for by servants sworn to secrecy. In the most tragic cases, there's evidence to suggest that some royal infants with severe disabilities were killed shortly after birth, their deaths disguised as natural infant mortality, which was common enough to provide perfect cover for such actions. These weren't acts of malice necessarily, but of fear. Fear of political instability, fear of questions about the royal bloodline's purity, fear of losing the divine authority that medieval monarchies relied upon.
This culture of concealment created a legacy that would persist well into the modern era, connecting the medieval period directly to the 20th century stories we've been following. Think about the progression. From medieval infanticide and monastery hiding, to Victorian-era institutionalization, to 20th century false death certificates and media cover-ups. The methods evolved, but the core motivation remained the same: protect the royal image at any cost. The Bowes-Lyon sisters' story becomes even more heartbreaking when we understand it as part of this centuries-long pattern. Their family wasn't uniquely cruel. They were following a playbook that had been written and rewritten by royal families for generations. But let's return to Nerissa and Katherine, whose story deserves to be completed because it reveals how this pattern of concealment finally began to break down. For decades, the sisters lived at Royal Earlswood Hospital, receiving minimal visits from their relatives. They celebrated birthdays that the world thought had stopped in childhood. They grew into women while their official records listed them as long-dead children. The truth began to emerge in the 1980s when investigative journalists started asking uncomfortable questions about the royal family tree. What they discovered sparked a scandal that would force the British public to confront the ugly reality of how their beloved royal family had treated its most vulnerable members. Nerissa had died in 1986, still at the institution, still largely forgotten by her family. Katherine would live until 2014, giving her nearly 90 years of life that the world never knew she had. When the story broke, public outrage was swift and severe. How could a family that preached about duty and service have abandoned two of their own so completely? But this exposure of past wrongs coincided with a revolution in how society viewed disability. The same decades that brought the royal secrets to light also saw the emergence of disability rights movements, medical advances, and changing social attitudes. Today, people with Down syndrome live lives that would have seemed impossible to the families in our stories. They attend universities, pursue careers, compete in athletics, perform in theaters, run businesses, and form meaningful relationships. They are no longer hidden away, but celebrated for their unique contributions to society. This transformation makes the historical treatment of royal children with disabilities even more poignant. We can now see what was lost, not just the individual lives that were diminished or hidden, but the contributions these people might have made if they had been allowed to participate fully in society. Imagine if Princess Alexandrine had been allowed to take on royal duties appropriate to her abilities. Picture Charles de Gaulle as a public advocate for disability rights in post-war France. Think about what Nerissa and Katherine might have accomplished if they had been raised in the palace instead of hidden in an institution.
These weren't just personal tragedies. They were losses for entire societies that missed out on the perspectives, insights, and contributions these individuals might have made. As our journey through this hidden history comes to an end, we return to where we began, those dusty, forgotten wings of royal palaces. But now we understand that these spaces weren't empty. They were filled with the echoes of children who deserved so much more than secrecy. Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, Anne de Gaulle, and countless others whose names we'll never know, they were not tragedies or mistakes. They were princes and princesses in the truest sense, deserving of love, recognition, and the right to write their own stories. The crowns they should have worn may have been kept from them, but they possessed something more valuable, a dignity that couldn't be taken away, no matter how deeply it was buried. By telling their stories now, we do something their families couldn't or wouldn't do. We acknowledge their worth, honor their memory, and ensure they are finally seen as the royal children they always were. Their legacy isn't one of shame or secrecy, but of resilience. They survive systems designed to erase them, and now, decades or centuries later, their stories emerge to teach us about the dangers of valuing image over humanity. In remembering them, we make a promise that no child, royal or otherwise, will ever again be treated as a secret to be hidden away. Because every child, regardless of their differences, deserves to be loved openly, valued completely, and remembered always. The hidden dynasty has finally been revealed, and their invisible crowns shine brighter than any jewels in any royal treasury.